There's been a lot the past couple years in terms of great budget devices, but the ones we're seeing this year really take the top of the list. I owned a Game Boy Advance SP growing up, and I absolutely love that device. This is the new RG35XXSP, and Anbernic, I really think you guys need to work on your naming. So for the rest of this video, I'm just going to call this the Anbernic SP, because that's just so much easier. Spoiler alert, I think this device is incredible for the dollar, and if you like the SP growing up, you have to buy this. It's just so crazy how nice this is. I've never been a fan of Anbernic devices in general. I just find their screens a little too unsaturated. I also find some of their quality control issues a little bit too much for my liking. But I like this one so much, I ended up buying two. This was paid for with my own wallet. I bought the silver one for full price at launch. This one I bought on the AliExpress sale. This one was about 75 Canadian. This one was about 105. So there's quite a difference between the two pricing on these. And if you watch for sales, you can get a really good deal on these too. This has been my main emulation device for the past couple of weeks, and I gotta say, this thing is really special. So is the RG35XXSP or the Anbernic SP worth it for you? Well, let's just hop in and take a closer look. If you buy this directly from Anbernic themselves, this comes down to $64.99 US. However, you do have to pay some shipping on this, so I would probably end up getting this on AliExpress, like I did. Keep an eye out for Choice Day on the beginning of each month, and you probably can get this for pretty cheap. I grabbed the silver one, and I also grabbed the transparent blue one. This device features a 3.5-inch IPS screen with 640 by 480 resolution. It also has the H700 quad-core CPU and a dual-core Mali GPU. This only comes with 1GB of LPDDR4 RAM. I bought two of the 64GB models, and it came with a brand name SD card. This is using their own version of Linux. We even get AC Wi-Fi and 5GHz bands. This also comes with Bluetooth 4.2, and you can also watch movies on here as well. We actually have a really good hinge on this device too, and I've been pretty impressed with it, but we'll take a closer look at that. The screen isn't bad, but it's not the most vibrant, but we'll also take a closer look at that later. Anbernic has said this will give you up to 8 hours of battery life, and I find this pretty accurate. Standby time hasn't been too bad either, and I haven't really noticed much battery drain if I put this in my pocket and come back to it later. HDMI out also seems to work really well, but I found it a little complicated to get the controller working on this while not messing up the internal config for their controller that's built in. Let's take a closer look at the SP itself. I've already been using the silver one for a good while, so let's set this aside and look at the blue one. Let's open it up and see what comes in the box. Inside the box, we of course get the device itself, and it's wrapped pretty nice. Comes in this little bag with a foam part on the top to protect it. The blue looks pretty good. It looks like they also put a sheet behind the screen just to have it a little bit more covered. All in all, this doesn't look too bad. So we got the device itself. What else do we get in the box? Well, underneath the packaging, we have, of course, the traditional screen protector that Anbernic sends, and we get a little user manual as well. Anbernic screen protectors are pretty decent, and I've never had issues with any of them. In the box, we of course just have the standard USB-A to USB-C. First impressions of the device are pretty good. This feels like a pretty solid device all around. The build quality is nice, and compared to other Anbernic devices, this feels more like a premium product. Fits nice into my hands, but we'll take a closer look at everything later. I'm not seeing any quality control concerns on both my models. The plastic looks really good. It's slightly transparent, but I kind of wish they had gone with a black motherboard. From what I'm seeing so far, I actually prefer the silver, but that's just of course a personal preference. The nice thing about this device compared to a lot of other devices is that it folds up. This will let this fit into your pocket a lot easier than most other budget devices. However, this is very thick, and I do notice it when I'm putting it in my pocket. But all in all, I think this should be very pocketable for a lot of people. If we compare this to the TrimUI Smart Pro, yeah, it's a lot smaller. Even with the SP fully extended, it's still a lot smaller. One area where I find the TrimUI Smart Pro a lot easier to put in your pocket is definitely with the thickness. The SP is a very thick device. The buttons are a little tall, and if they had made those a little bit more shallow, they could have gotten away with a lot smaller bottom on this. And you can see the thickness differences right here. Look at the difference. You're less likely to feel the TrimUI Smart Pro in your pocket, at least thickness wise. You're going to need some pretty deep pockets to fit this, but you can fit this in a more shallow pocket. The SP thickness is 27.4 millimeters. All in all, this is not too bad, but I think they could have gotten away with shrinking this down a little bit to get closer to that 20 millimeter mark. I find the TrimUI Smart Pro also very pocketable, and that's because this only comes out to 18 millimeters. Even at the thickest part near the triggers, this is only 18.7 millimeters. These are not the most comfortable triggers in the world. They went for a pretty good balance on this while maintaining some pocketability on this device. The only other device that I have that's even more pocketable is the MIUI 30, and I'm going to be working on my review for this one, so make sure to stay subscribed. This device is even thinner at only 15.9 millimeters. This is remarkably small for a device. The best way I can describe it is this feels like having a wallet in your pocket, whereas the MIUI 30 feels kind of like having a package of gum. This is really that small and it's so light, but we'll take a closer look at the weights in a little bit. If you don't mind having a big wallet in your pocket, then I don't think the SP is going to bother you. But if you want something smaller, you might want to look at something like the MIUI 30. This is obviously going to have some trade-offs as well, but the sizing is definitely nice. As far as the other size factors go, well, this device comes out to 89.2 millimeters wide and 85.2 millimeters long. The screen itself is pretty thin at only 8.1 millimeters deep, but the bottom is much thicker at 19.1 millimeters. Even the Odin 2 Mini comes out to 19.4 millimeters. This is much thinner overall compared to the SP. In fact, every single device that I own is pretty much thinner than the SP. The Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is extremely thin at only 15.8 millimeters. If you measure up by where the triggers are, though, this comes out to 24.3, which is still much thinner than the SP at 27.3. In fact, I think the Odin 2 is even thinner. The only part that's thicker is up by the triggers thanks to those big grips on the back, and that comes out to 30.8. That's still only a tad thicker than the SP. So how heavy is the SP? Well, let's stack it up to some different units that I have just to see how heavy this thing is. The SP comes out to 194.2 grams, so this is a pretty light device. The silver one is only slightly heavier at 195.2. That's really not much between these two devices, but I'm kind of surprised to see a little bit of a weight difference. 195.2 versus 194.2. So there's really only 1 gram difference between these two shells. The lightest device that I own is the MIUI 30, which is only 112.6 grams. As mentioned, this kind of feels just like a pack of gum in your pocket. It's so light, but it also feels pretty high quality. And just a spoiler alert, I actually kind of like this device so far. Comparing this to other devices, the Mio Mini Plus comes out to 163 grams, so it's only slightly lighter than the SP. Comparing that to the 35XX Plus, that comes out to 188.7. This still feels like a very good weight for a device, and it's extremely pocketable still. Stepping things up from there, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is a little heavier at 275.8 grams. The TrimUI Smart Pro is 254.6 grams. The Odin 2 Mini is even heavier at 324.9 grams. The Odin 2 is the biggest ARM device that I own. This thing comes out to 426.3 grams. So in terms of what's closest, well, most of these other devices are just plain heavier. The closest in comparison is probably the 35XX Plus. At 190 grams nearly, this is only about 5 grams away. Hilariously, this is almost identical in weight to my actual phone at 195.3 versus the Poco F3's 196.3. Next up, let's take a closer look at the build quality. Well, the build quality is pretty good, as I first mentioned when we opened it up. The only thing that I've noticed is some of the paint has started to wear away on the back of my silver model. I think this is largely in part to me putting this down onto my desk. I'm not sliding it around at all though, so I find this very interesting to see the paint wearing away. I do think the paint job is decent, but they definitely could have done a better job. If you look at this really closely, you can see just exactly where that paint has started to wear away. Just at the top up here. It's not bad, but it's definitely noticeable. I'm really good with my stuff too, so this is kind of concerning to see the paint wear away so quickly. The rest of the shell has held up over the past couple of weeks, and I don't really notice anything else anywhere else. The back of the screen still looks really good, and where the buttons are has really held up to the test of time too. All in all, just the only wear that I can see is on the back where this device sits onto my table. It's not a lot, but it's just something to take note of. I'm really good with my stuff as mentioned, and I've still kind of got a few scuffs on there. When this goes in my pocket, there's nothing else with it, so this is just the device. So I definitely know it's for my table. The other thing that I've noticed from using this build quality wise is just the rattle. Let me see if I can show you what that sounds like. It doesn't sound very good though. This rattle is persistent across all the Anbernic devices that I've used. I'm not sure why they just can't get their button molds down to fit the slots a little better. It's not a big thing, but it does kind of cheapen the feel of a device that would otherwise feel pretty premium. Have you guys noticed Anbernic's button rattle? What do you think about it? This is why I got rid of the 353VS. You can still hear it on the 35XX Plus as well. Every single Anbernic device that I've had has had this rattle. Next up, let's take a closer look at these buttons. They've been pretty good overall. These are dome-based buttons, so they're extremely clicky. The menu button specifically is extremely loud, but the start and select is even louder. You won't hear this if you're sitting in somewhere like a cafe. The bumpers and triggers are really quiet. It's mostly just the menu button and the start and select. I really wish they had gone with rubber membrane on these, or at least slightly quieter switches. The ABXY isn't loud enough to bother me personally, and as mentioned, I'm really picky with this kind of thing. But the start and select does bother me. If you're used to quieter buttons, this is likely to bother you too. Let me show you what these sound like. These are just so loud. The D-pad and the ABXY buttons doesn't bother me, and fortunately this is the buttons you're going to use most. I do kind of dread pressing the start and select buttons just because they're so loud, and I don't look forward to pressing the menu button either. In fact, even the volume button is pretty loud. I just wanted to look at the out-of-box experience on this device just to show you guys what to expect when you buy this. How about the ergonomics? Well, it's actually not as bad as you expect. Because the bottom's a little bigger, it lets your hands kind of wrap around the sides. These corners are sharp, but thankfully it's kind of a soft plastic, so it rounds out nicely into the palm of your hand. Your two pointer fingers fit on the triggers, your fingers just kind of fold across the back, and I still find this very comfortable. All in all, the ergonomics are decent, and I think this is going to be pretty good for most people. Comparing to other devices of this price range, well, there's a few differences. Well, your hands are kind of closer together on this compared to a horizontal one. On something like the TrimUI Smart Pro, your hands can sit further apart, and your fingers don't overlap in the back. This feels more comfortable to me. The sides on this are also rounded, and I find this much more comfortable in the palm of your hands, but the SP is still very comfortable. The width of the device is actually going to feel very similar to the Mio A30 because this one is only slightly wider. Your hands are still going to kind of overlap on the back of this one, and your pointer fingers kind of sit on those triggers. I think horizontal devices are just going to have an edge in comfort. These devices are thinner in your pocket, but one area that the SP has is that folding top. Strangely enough, I find the SP even more comfortable than small devices like the Mio Mini Plus. This is because on this device, not only do you have to bunch your hands together like on the SP, but this device is also much thinner than the SP. And because the SP has a thicker back, it also gives you a little bit more grip. You're almost just basically cupping your hands to play this. And your fingers are so close. In fact, this is one of the reasons I sold the Mio Mini originally, before buying the Plus later. This also has some height on the back, and this is long enough that it's going to kind of sit into the palm of your hand so you can hold it a little better. All in all, I think the ergonomics are decent, and I don't think they're going to bother anybody, especially if you played the SP before as a kid. What about loading this up? Thankfully, this device comes preloaded with a card, so you don't have to do anything when you get it. These also come with a brand name Kioxia card. These are made by Toshiba, and they're pretty good microSD cards. These are much better than you get in most emulation devices. This microSD card sits in the TF1 slot, and this also has the firmware files on it, so if this becomes corrupted, your device won't boot unless you get those firmware files back. I've actually corrupted my microSD card a few times on Anbernic devices, and I thought the device was dead, but turns out I just didn't have the SD card inserted, or something was wrong with the SD card in general. They also load these up with games, so you don't really have to load your own collection on them. So just a quick overview before we turn on the device. We of course have the face buttons and the D-pad, and we also have the start and select and the menu button on the front. On the back of the device, we have the L1 and L2, as well as the USB port and an HDMI, as well as the R1 and R2. The HDMI has been pretty good so far, and the USBs worked well. On the left side, we have the volume buttons. I kind of wish that they had gone for the SP style slider volume, so you could have just slid it up and down. I'm not crazy about these buttons, and they're pretty loud as we saw. On the right side, we have the reset button and the power button itself. Thankfully, the way that your hand sits, it's not likely to hit this button, because your finger just doesn't push into the side like that. It does take a few seconds for the device to start up. Once you boot in though, you come to this menu. The volume's pretty loud though, so let me turn this down. Another annoying thing is you can't actually hold down the button on the side to adjust the volume. It just doesn't work. You have to press it each individual time to turn it all the way down to 0. So you have the game rooms, and this has all your game collection in it. Unfortunately, when you launch a game through the game rooms, you don't get those bezels. It's just going to look like this, and it's just going to kind of fill most of the screen. I don't really like it. If you press the menu button again, it'll come up with this menu here, and we can exit the game from this menu as well. We can load our game or save the state, and we can change the video display effect. It takes a second to exit the games as well. If we load a game from the RetroArch game menu, it does have those preset bezels. I think this looks a lot nicer. If we're in the RetroArch game menu and you adjust the volume, you can just hold it down, which is really nice. Mine also started with the FPS on the top right corner, so you're going to have to turn that off. To shut off the FPS display, just press the menu once, then press back. From the menu, go to your settings, then click User Interface, then click on the on-screen notifications, click on Notification Visibility, then turn off Display Frame Rate. This will shut off the FPS counter. Then just make sure you go back to the main menu, scroll down to Configuration File, and save the current configuration. Then just go back to your main menu and either quit the game, or you can go to your quick menu and resume. You have that Game Boy Advance SP bezel in here. I think that looks really nice. This gives you an authentic feel. The FPS counter is gone now too, thankfully. I think overall, loading games from this menu just looks really nice. Let's press the menu button and exit for now to look at the other menus. We have the favorites menu after that, and we can load any game into our favorites menu by just going down to the game itself. And say I wanted to put Crazy Taxi in there, all I have to do is press the start button. This will put that into the favorites menu, and I can play that later through there. To the right of that, there's a history tab showing all the games you played recently. We can also search for games here. There's an app center that we can watch things like movies or music. We can even read an ebook on here if we really wanted to. I'm not sure why you'd want to do that, but the option is there if you want it. There's also an expert menu, and there's more apps that you can load off the microSD card. To the right of that is the settings menu, and there's a few things that we can change in here. You can change it when the screen will lock. I'm going to set mine to about 5 minutes because the battery is pretty good. You can adjust the backlight brightness. I like a bright, vibrant panel, so I'm going to set mine to 5. I also recommend doing an I/O test in here just to make sure that everything works. So check your D-pad, check your buttons, start and select, then just check your triggers to make sure those work too. Everything else seems to work really well. So I'm going to exit that test. You can adjust the time and date in here, your language. You can edit the RetroArch settings directly. In the network settings, we can connect to the Wi-Fi and connect any Bluetooth devices we might have. You can change your icon settings, so this is kind of like a theme. Once you find one you want, just click it and it'll change that over. You can also change the background image moving down the page. You can turn on and off the button sound. I personally want that off. These buttons are plenty audible already. You can do custom buttons, or you can restore the defaults here. Clearing record will probably clear off your save file, so just be careful with that. You can also turn on and off the light during sleep. I probably want that off because I usually remember when I put my devices in sleep. You also have a reboot and shutdown on this menu as well. If you don't want your icons that you've just selected, you can go back and change those in the settings menu. If you want the default, just go to Style 2 and select Icon 0. This will bring these icons back to their defaults. To enter the sleep, all you have to do is tap the power button once. This will shut the device into its hibernate state, and you can see that the screen is completely shut off. You can also enter an exit sleep mode by closing the hinge. You have to get pretty dang close. The screen didn't shut off till I was about here, and you barely saw that. Opening that up again, the screen instantly turns on. Installing the games is pretty easy. All you have to do is just pull out the microSD card and insert it into your computer. This already comes preloaded with a lot of games, and there's just not any duplicates from what I've seen. So you should be okay using this microSD card as is. There's very little tinkering with this device. Let's do a quick boot test next, just to show you how quick it starts up and shuts off. Shutting off is pretty quick, just hold down the power button, and it takes a few seconds, but it shuts down pretty decently. Now let's see how quick this thing starts up. So I'm going to press this button, and as soon as that light comes on, I'm going to start the timer, and I'll put it on the screen. Startup time wasn't too bad, but you can also use Hibernate if you're playing this on and off throughout the day. I would only shut this off physically if I was not going to play this for probably the next 3 hours. Anything over 3 hours of Hibernate, and I would just shut it off. But the standby time is pretty good anyways, so I don't think you're going to have issues with that. That's just how I use it. I mentioned this before on many of my reviews, but you don't need an A2 card with a fast write speed and read speed to play emulation. Something like this Kioxia card that they've included is plenty fast. You're not going to need anything quicker for emulation. I tried emulating some big systems, and no matter what I loaded the game off of, whether it was a hard drive, microSD card, A1, A2, or an M2 SSD, it all loaded the same. These were games that were over 5 gigabytes. Personally, I just don't think this thing needs any more than 128 gigabytes just from the amount of games that it plays. Dreamcast games and PSP games are going to be your biggest hitters. Those are only about 512 megabytes to about a gigabyte each. So how are the speakers on this device? Well, let's test it out, and I'll compare it to a few other devices around this price bracket just to show you what it sounds like. This is only mono sound, and it's just coming from this one speaker in the center. It's not bad, but it's about what you expect for this price bracket. Even at 100% volume, this has no distortion whatsoever. There's a pretty solid speaker on here for a budget device. Let's compare this to the TrimUI Smart Pro just to see how different these two devices are audio-wise. I wouldn't say this is bad by any means, but it's definitely nothing to write home about. What do you guys think about the speakers on the Anbernic SP? Another thing that I think we should try out is the headphone jack quality. Sometimes on these cheaper devices, you will get a little bit of hissing, so let's plug in some headphones and check it out. Well, the audio actually sounds pretty good. As someone played a lot of Crazy Taxi as a kid, this doesn't sound too bad. I still can't believe this thing can play Dreamcast. I know this chip has enough power to play Dreamcast, it's just so weird seeing Dreamcast on an SP. If I turn down the volume to 0, I don't hear any hissing, and I don't hear any distortions as I turn it up a little louder. The loudest I'd want to turn this up is probably about 60%, at least on these headphones that I have here. But at least the headphone jack works well enough to use. I think it's about time we talk about one of the big issues with this device. We know these face buttons and everything else sound a little loud, but one of the big problems with them is this D-pad. At least from my testing, this has been slightly sore on my thumb to move back and forth. All in all, the D-pad is pretty good and the edges have a slight flare to them. The center has a nice pivot and it doesn't bottom out. There's a small divot in the center where that post is that lets you rock it really easy, but this does take a lot of pressure to push down, and this is one of the reasons why I don't like this D-pad. Let me show you what I'm talking about. It's not a bad D-pad, but when you're moving around really quick like this, it can actually hurt your thumb. This might not be for everybody, but I just find my thumb getting really sore playing this game. I was suggested to use your thumb as like a pivot and just go back and forth rather than rocking it, but I find it still does the same thing. It just hurts my thumb. I can probably play this for about 10 minutes before my thumb just starts to tense up. I wonder if it's because this D-pad is too tight, or more likely the fact that my thumb is having to angle itself down to press it. If I had my hand down a little further, this might be a little bit more comfortable. So you really have to watch your placement with this device. But yeah, I haven't been playing this thing more than a couple minutes and my thumb's already starting to get sore. This is only on shoot 'em up titles though, like Musha, and I haven't noticed this on any other system. My other devices, the D-pad just feels a lot more loose, and so this is a lot easier to play with. If you already own the SP, I'm curious to know what you think of this D-pad. Do you find it too stiff? I do think the D-pad is a good size though overall, and it kind of feels very similar to the original. In terms of size, this D-pad comes out to 21.2 millimeters, so I think this is a pretty good size all around. The buttons are also pretty decent at 7.6 millimeters each, and I find these buttons are far enough apart that you're not going to hit them accidentally. In fact, this is a very similar placement and distance compared to the A30. I do find these buttons a little bit more comfortable though, as they're rubber membrane, not switch based. And the D-pad on the A30 is also more comfortable, but I think this is a lot more accurate and you're less likely to get false diagonals on this. I also wanted to show you the silver one that I've been using primarily the last couple weeks, and just to show you that there has been no button rubbing whatsoever. There's a good amount of space around these, so you're not likely to have any. I've noticed this on a few devices, but the SP is definitely not one of them. As far as the panel goes, it's pretty decent. I've maxed out the brightness completely. This is just the IPS screen colors. So I am noticing that the color itself is slightly washed out. This is pretty typical on most Anbernic panels. It's not bad, but I'm finding there's not a lot of saturation. Blue looks good, green and every other color looks fine. Where I find Anbernic panels just fade off is on the yellows. To me anyways, the yellows on this just don't look as vibrant as a lot of the other panels that I've seen. If we compare this to a screen that is well known for being oversaturated on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, there's a big difference. However, if I had to pick between these two, I definitely find the screen on the Retroid unit much better. The TrimUI Smart Pro is somewhat closer, but I do find those yellows much more saturated. I do also find the screen much brighter too, and all in all, I just prefer the TrimUI Smart Pro screen over the SP. I find the Mio Mini Plus screen is much more similar compared to the SP. However, I'm noticing that this screen is much darker than the SP. I do prefer the colors, but there's a little bit of details that are washed out. The Mio Mini Plus just can't get bright enough to show any detail. This is with this device completely maxed out on brightness, and this one is also maxed out as well. If I had to pick between these two, I still think the SP is better than the Mio Mini Plus. If we were to compare this to the original Mio Mini though, I'm sure this might tell a different story. Dropping the price even more to the A30, the screen is not actually that bad. I find the A30 saturation a little better, and the colors look much more vibrant. The A30 is also a matte screen, so this one does look a little different. If I had to pick between these two, I do prefer the A30's colors. What do you guys think about the SP screen? Make sure to let me know in the comments below. The GBA screen can get quite dark. If I turn this all the way down, the brightness has gone down significantly. The brightness is also decent at max too, and even under these bright studio lights, you can see everything that you need to. I think they went with a pretty good panel. I just wish that those yellows had a little bit more detail to them and that the colors were just slightly more saturated. All in all, the panel is not bad. The performance is pretty decent. All your old classic retro systems are going to run with no issues. And if you launch them through that menu, you get these nice bezels. I like playing a lot of Genesis on mine and Game Boy Advance, of course. PSP also runs pretty decent on here, but I'm just not big into the PSP library. There's a few games that I've tried, and they all seem to work fine. Dreamcast is the one that I wanted to see if it worked the most, and from what I've tried, most of these work pretty good. These are all the games that it came with, and I haven't loaded any extras on there. The original PlayStation 1 also works really good on here. So basically what you're looking at is PlayStation and Dreamcast with PSP being the upper limit. Game Gear also seems to work really well too. You are going to notice a few slowdowns, but I think that's more on Game Gear emulation in general. I don't think we're running into any hardware limitations. This is just more of a Game Gear emulation thing. And I've noticed these slowdowns on every single device, including the Analog Pocket. Maybe I just need to learn a little bit more about Game Gear emulation in general. Game Boy Color also plays really nice on here. All these systems come preset with this nice pixel style effect and these bezels. One thing I'm just not sold about is this screen. As you can see, the colors are pretty washed out. This is of course with their filters on, and we can shut this off to see what it looks like. With the colorization options off, the screen is much more vibrant. I've ditched the Game Boy colorization and just gone for more of a classic IPS look. I think this looks much better overall. The black levels are pretty decent too. All in all, this is not a bad panel if you take your time and adjust it to your liking. I keep mine on max brightness and I like to shut the colorization options off. I just find this looks the best. But again, this just really comes down to personal preference. One system I like to leave the colorization options on is for Game Boy. It looks pretty good. And when you're playing this, it adds to the extra level of nostalgia. So I like to leave this on for Game Boy. A lot of the old systems as well, like NES, looks pretty good with the default colorization options. I just find anything with a lot of color, I probably want to shut that off. But classic retro stuff that didn't have a lot of color looks fine with the colorization options on. I do really like this blue, but we need to talk about these two plastics. First up, this solid texture. The silver is very reflective. If I put a little bit of light on it, it completely overblows the shot. I do really like the texture though. It's kind of smooth. As we saw earlier though, some of that paint is already coming off. I don't know what kind of paint they used for this, but for some reason it just doesn't seem very durable. The transparent one shouldn't have this issue, but you can see everything through the back, and I'm not crazy about this little zebra design battery. It looks okay, but personally I would have just preferred a black battery. The same is true for the PCB underneath. This is just a personal preference, but I would have preferred having a black PCB over a white one. Then again, this is just my personal preference. You might actually like the white PCB in this transparent plastic. Another thing about transparent plastics is if for some reason you do get dust underneath it, you are going to see it through there, and the only way to get it out is of course to open it up. So if little things bother you like that, I would definitely look at getting the solid colors over the transparent. But hopefully the transparent plastic should last a little bit longer than the solid ones. Speaking of plastics, I don't notice any temperature differences between the transparent and the solid. Even after gaming for a little while, these things don't go over 33 degrees Celsius. The back is definitely the hottest. I don't notice heat being an issue on this device at all in general. The other issue that I have is some people have reported this back battery door creaking. I don't notice it on my transparent blue one, but on the silver one, the top corner does creak ever so slightly. This side's okay, but this side over here just creaks a little bit. It's not bad, but I definitely recommend checking the screw to make sure it's tightened all the way. This could be model to model variances too, so it really depends. This device will only charge with USB-A to USB-C, not with USB-C to USB-C. Right, so this cable is plugged in with USB-A on the other side, so let's plug this in and see how well it works. And with the tester tool plugged in, we are getting it charging now. So this device is charging at 5 volt, 1.5 amps at 7 watt quick charging. It does look like it jumps up to 7.5 watt quick charging in short bursts, but for the most part it sticks at 7 watts. This is pretty standard for most emulation devices anyways. This is actually slightly quicker charging than the 35XX Plus. This one only goes up to 5.6 watts. Also, to show you, this is matching exactly the same charging that we see on the MIUI 30. So this is definitely pretty standard for most emulation devices. In fact, this is pretty much on par with the Mio Mini Plus. This one is still getting 5 volts, 1.5 amps at about 7.5 to 8 watt charging. Not bad, but pretty standard. One of the last things I wanted to talk about is this hinge. This hinge is pretty dang good. It feels very strong, and it's got a nice range of flexibility to it. It feels very smooth as I open it, and it's got a locking position similar to the original SP. The screen will go back to about where the original SP stops at too. This is about how far it'll go. Unfortunately, with the hinge, as soon as there's any give though, it'll just snap back to that one position. It would have been nice to have a few different positions to have locking points at, but it's not bad. It closes up nice, and it feels soft when it closes. The hinge on the transparent one goes down a little further than the one on their silver. I'm not sure if it's just because this one is a little loose. If I shake this, the silver one seems to hold on pretty strong. In fact, being in the locked position, this isn't moving at all. However, the blue one does seem to wobble a little bit. I'm not sure why. And it feels much more loose. You can kind of see that too. This is what it looks like wobbling. That's how much play it has in it. I'm not pushing too hard, but I am pushing just a little bit, and it definitely has some play to it. Whereas on the silver one, it almost feels like it's locked in place a little better. It's kind of weird, eh? I wonder if they're using different hinges, or if there's just some slight variances on these. So would I recommend the Anbernic 35XXSP? If you had the original Game Boy Advance SP, yeah, I definitely think you would like this. As whether or not to get the silver or the blue, if you want more of an authentic feel, I would go for the silver. As this shell wears down over time too, it might look more authentic in a way as well. I don't mind the stock operating system, and everything seems to work well. The build quality is really good, and it's very comfortable to game on. The battery life is excellent, and I see upwards of 8 hours. The screen is decent. Game Boy Advance games look extra sharp thanks to that pixel style effect and the nice overlay. I also am not noticing any light bleed around the edges. Obviously, the entire screen is being illuminated since it's IPS, but since the black levels are really good, it almost makes me feel like this isn't part of the actual screen. I was shocked how authentic this looked when I had it in my hand. And I've actually gone to play this before and thought it was the original SP, and I went to adjust the volume like this, only to be reminded, oops, this isn't an actual SP. When I had the silver one out, I actually had someone comment on it. They looked at it and said, "Wow, I haven't seen someone play a Game Boy Advance in forever. That's so cool to see people play it still." I just looked at him and said, well, this isn't exactly a Game Boy Advance, but it's close enough. Anbernic did a fantastic job on this. I'm not crazy about Anbernic units, and out of all the devices that I pick up, I just haven't been a fan of them. But I can't believe I'm saying this, I actually like this thing. I think it's pretty cool. This has what many emulation devices don't have: nostalgia. I think if you started playing a game on this, and you weren't really paying attention to the emulation features, you'd probably think this was an original Game Boy. My biggest negatives on this device so far are of course the button rattle. I've only had this for probably 2 or 3 weeks, and this is what it looks like. I'm also extremely careful, and I'm not even sure how this happened. The plastic creak on the back might bother some people. It's very minimal on mine, and I barely notice it. The last issue is very game specific. If you're using the D-pad a lot, and you have your hands kind of positioned up higher, this is going to get really sore really fast. If you're playing a shoot 'em up title like Musha, make sure you position your hand further down and you just slide it across. Don't pivot your thumb like this. You're going to get a really sore thumb really quick. Just slide it across and don't angle it down. But everything else about the device I like. I think it's got a good screen, the buttons feel authentic, the shell is a really good quality. I like the speaker, even though it's mono, it sounds really good, just like the original SP. All in all, fantastic device. If you're interested or you're on the fence, I think you'll really like this one. What do you think about it? Make sure to let me know in the comments below. What color do you like the best from their lineup, and what colors do you think Anbernic should make next? I really hope they make a red one, because I would probably sell these two and buy that in a heartbeat. As always, I'll make sure to leave links to the product in the description below and an affiliate link if you want to help support the channel. Do you like the Anbernic RG35XXSP, and are you picking one up? If you have any questions, make sure to ask in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos, and as always, thanks for watching.